They said her heart would give out before the first snow melted. A duke bought a dying girl to satisfy a dead man's will, carried her to a ruin on the edge of the sea, and rode away at dawn without once looking at the water. Everyone in 3 parishes agreed she would be underground by spring, and the duke agreed with them most of all, for a dead wife would leave him both his inheritance and his freedom in a single stroke. What none of them reckoned on was that the frail bride left to perish on the Cornish cliffs had no intention of dying to anyone's convenience. And so, 3 winters later, when the Duke of Renmere came at last to bury her, the woman who opened the door was not a ghost, and she owed him nothing at all. The chapel at Renmere was cold in the particular way that only old stone can be cold, a chill that came up through the soles of the shoes and settled into the bones and stayed. Rosamund Merrick held to the altar rail because she needed to, and because her father had told her that morning, on the road, to keep her chin up and not to shame him. She had wanted to laugh at that, though laughing cost her breath she could not spare, for there was no one present to be shamed before. The pews stood empty save for her father, Ambrose Merrick, in his one good coat gone shiny at the elbows, and too large now across the shoulders, and a curate who read the marriage service the way a clerk reads out a bill of lading, without lifting his eyes from the page. The man beside her did not once look at her. Alexander Mallory, Duke of Renmere, stood tall and unmoving in unrelieved black, and he spoke his half of the vows in a voice that held about as much warmth as a shut account book. He had a hard, well-made face that gave nothing away, and eyes fixed on some point beyond the altar, beyond the east wall, somewhere Rosamund could not follow him. When the curate asked for the ring, the Duke produced it without ceremony, and slid it over her knuckle. It was far too large. It turned loose on her finger, cold as everything else in that place, and she closed her hand to keep it from falling to the flags. She swayed once. The room went pale at its edges, the way it did when she had spent more of herself than she had to spend, and she gripped the rail until the carved wood bit into her palm and the greyness passed off. If the Duke marked it, he gave no sign, but she caught the curate's glance flick to her, and away again, and she understood the look for what it was. It was the look a man gives a candle guttering in a draught. He was not wondering whether. He was only counting how long. Rheumatic fever had taken her at 15 and given her back at 17, with a heart that stumbled at the least exertion, a body that spent itself on a flight of stairs, and no future her father could any longer afford to keep. The Merrick money had gone down with 3 ships and a bad partnership within a single year, and a sick daughter was a debt, not a dowry, until a solicitor came to their lodgings with a proposal so strange that Ambrose Merrick read the letter through 3 times before he would believe it was real. The late Duke of Renmere, it appeared, had written a clause into his will out of piety or out of spite, and no one now living was certain which. His son would inherit the whole of the Renmere estates on one condition only, that he be married before his 30th birthday. Fail in that, and the greater part passed to a cousin the old Duke had favoured, and the son had spent his life despising. Alexander Mallory needed a wife, and he needed her before the quarter day, and above all he wanted a wife who would lay no claim on him, keep no house he was obliged to enter, and trouble him as little and as briefly as it was possible for a wife to do. A ruined merchant's daughter with a failing heart answered every one of those requirements to the letter. It was, the solicitor had said, with a delicate curl of distaste about the words, a matter of business, and no more. So it was. Rosamund understood from the first hour that she was a signature and a heartbeat, and that the second of these was expected to cease not long after the first was obtained, to everyone's quiet satisfaction. She signed regardless. There had been nothing else in the world left for her to sign, and a woman who is going to be discarded may as well be discarded into a title as into a poorhouse. They left within the hour of the wedding. The carriage was well sprung and the pair of horses good, and these were the only 2 kindnesses of the entire journey. The Duke sat across from her with a book he never turned a page of, and watched a countryside that grew wilder and barer the further west they went. Rosamund tried once to make some small remark about the weather, and he answered her in 3 words without turning his head, and she did not try a second time. She was not offended. She was tired, and the dull ache behind her ribs that meant she had drawn too deep on her strength wanted careful husbanding. So she studied him instead, quietly, in the way she studied everything, and she came to see that his stillness was not calm at all. It was a lid held hard down over something that did not want to stay under it. They drove the whole of a short winter day, and the light was already failing when the land began to drop away and the very smell of the air changed. Salt and weed and the great cold breathing of the sea. Rosamond had never in her life seen the sea. She leaned to the glass despite herself, and there it was below them, grey and vast and endlessly moving, and something in her chest lifted at the sight of it, even as the cold came off the pain against her cheek. The Duke did not look. She noticed that, and she never afterward forgot it. As the road ran out along the top of the cliff with the water spread enormous and darkening beneath, Alexander Mallory kept his gaze fixed on the far wall of the carriage, and the muscle stood out along his jaw, and his hand where it rested upon his knee closed slowly and deliberately into a fist. He did not look at the sea once, not through the whole of that high and dreadful road, and Rosamond set the fact away in the careful storehouse of her mind, understanding nothing of it yet, only that it mattered. Gullhaven Hall stood at the very end of the road, where the land itself ran out and gave up. It was a long, low, grey, many-gabled house, older by 100 years than the great Renmere seat, and the weather had been chewing at it a very long time. Slates gone from the roof in ragged patches, ivy prizing the mortar apart, 2 of the upper windows boarded over with grey planking. It sat with its back to the wind and its face to the sea, and the sea had not been gentle with it. Rosamond looked up at it through the streaming carriage glass, and thought that in the failing light it seemed less a dwelling than some large grey thing the tide had carried up and left behind to rot. A woman came out to meet them carrying a lantern, broad and weathered and somewhere past her 50th year, her reddened hands folded into her apron against the cold. This was Mrs. Pengelly, the housekeeper, who together with an old groundsman and 1 girl up from the cove made the whole of what remained of Gullhaven's household. She dropped a curtsy to the Duke and turned to Rosamond a pair of frank, appraising eyes, and Rosamond watched her arrive at exactly the same conclusion the curate had arrived at, and then watched her fold that conclusion away behind a face long schooled to give nothing back. The Duke would not go inside. He stood in the weed-grown forecourt with the wind dragging at the skirts of his coat and delivered his instructions in a level, carrying voice. The Duchess was to be made comfortable. The household accounts would be sent down quarterly. A physician in the town 3 miles off had been retained, should he be wanted. He said the word Duchess each time, as though it were a term in a language he did not speak. Then he drew a leather purse from within his coat and held it out, and for the space of a breath he looked directly at Rosamond, the first time in that whole long day that he had, and there was something in his face she could not name then, and only named much later. Not cruelty, she came to think, but a kind of flinching, as if the plain sight of her cost him more than he could well afford. "This will answer for whatever is wanted," he said. "You will not be troubled by me." "No," Rosamond agreed, meeting the look and holding it until he was the one to break it. "I don't imagine that I shall." Something moved behind his eyes at that, quick and gone, but he only inclined his head a fraction and turned and walked to his horse and mounted. He did not so much as pass a single night beneath Gullhaven's roof. He took rooms at the inn in the town, and before the first grey had touched the water the next morning, he was on the road again and riding east, away from the house, away from the sea, and he did not come back. Rosamond stood at the window of the great cold master bedchamber that first night, wrapped in every shawl she owned, one over the other, and watched the black moving shape of the sea and listened to it work and work at the foot of the cliffs below. She was 17 years old. She had been married and abandoned within the compass of a single day, 3 miles from the nearest soul who so much as knew her name, in a house that every person she had met that day plainly expected to be her grave before the year turned. She waited to feel despair, because it seemed the thing a girl in her position ought to feel. What rose in her instead, underneath the cold and the bone-deep weariness, was a small, hard flame of something that she recognized, after a while, as pure affront. They had all of them decided that she was going to die. Every last one, from her father to the curate to the man now riding away in the dark. They had looked at her and seen a foregone conclusion, a sum already worked, an ending merely waiting on the date. "We shall see about that," she said aloud, to the sea, and her voice was thin and it shook, but the words in it did not. She very nearly died, all the same. That was the truth of the matter, and she never in after years pretended otherwise, for she had no patience with a lie, even a flattering one. December came down hard off the Atlantic, and it brought with it a fever that got deep into her chest and would not be turned out. For the better part of 6 weeks she was scarcely herself at all. She kept only fragments of that time afterward. The low, water-stained ceiling of the small room she had been carried to, the smell of tallow and of bitter herbs steeping, Mrs. Pengelly's rough hands turning her in the sheets, the girl Tamsin weeping without sound by the door because she was young and believed that weeping was the correct thing to do beside a deathbed, and always the sea, through the very walls, the endless patient count of it, until in her worst nights Rosamond became certain that it was reading over a long list of names and had come at last to hers. The fever broke near Candlemas, in the dead grey heart of the winter. She woke one morning hollowed out and weak as poured water, her nightgown soaked cold through, and discovered that she was, against every expectation and every careful arrangement that had been made concerning her, still alive. Mrs. Pengelly was asleep upright in the hard chair drawn close beside the bed, her chin dropped to her chest, and there were hollows worn dark beneath her eyes that had not been there when Rosamond arrived, and Rosamond understood, lying there looking at her, that this hard and weathered woman had sat up through the black middle of it night upon night, though she was paid to do no such thing and had been handed every reason in the world to suppose the trouble would very shortly be over of its own accord. "You stayed," Rosamond said, when the housekeeper stirred and woke. Mrs. Pengelly straightened with a wince and rubbed a hand down over her face and regarded her a long moment. "I don't hold with the sea taking what's given me to mine," she said at last, gruffly, as though the admission had been dragged out of her against her better judgment. "Not without. It has a fight for it, any road." And then, because she was not a woman built for such moments, and this one had gone on quite long enough for her taste, she rose and announced that she would fetch broth, and went and fetched it. That was the beginning of everything. Rosamond never afterward forgot that Mrs. Pengelly had fought the sea on her behalf, before ever she had done a single thing to earn it. It made her want, with a fierceness that surprised her, to be a woman worth the trouble of that fight. She was months in getting back her strength, and she never in truth got the whole of it, and she knew as much and made her peace with the knowing. She would always be the woman obliged to sit down halfway up a stair and wait for the world to steady. She would always pay for a hard morning with a grey and useless afternoon. Her heart could still, without any warning at all, set up its frightening flutter and stumble and race until her lips went faintly blue and her sight swam. But she found, as that first winter loosened its grip toward spring, that a body might be frail and a will might yet be iron, and that a very great deal could be accomplished from a chair, with a pen, by a woman who had simply made up her mind that she would not stop. The first thing she did, once she could walk the length of a passage without resting, was to abandon the master wing altogether. It was sheer madness to attempt to heat it. A suite of enormous rooms with ceilings lost in shadow and windows that rattled the cold straight in, and chimneys built to draw the weather down rather than the smoke up, the whole of it raised to impress guests who would now never come. She had very nearly died of the plain cold in it, so she took for herself instead the small room off the old kitchen, where the great iron range burned day and night, and the thick stone floor held the day's heat long into the dark, and she had a proper bed carried down and set up in it, and she moved herself bodily into the warm, beating heart of the house, and shut the grand, cold shell of it away behind her. Mrs. Pengelly thought the arrangement beneath the dignity of a duchess, and said so. Rosamond observed that a living commoner in a warm room was worth a great deal more to the world than a dead duchess in a cold one, and Mrs. Pengelly considered this for a moment, and then let out a short, startled bark of a laugh, and that was the second stone come down out of the wall that stood between them. The next thing she did was to read the accounts. She had a merchant's daughter's head for a column of figures, whatever else her body could no longer manage, and it cost her 3 evenings by the range with the ledgers open on her knees to see plainly that Gullhaven was being quietly bled. Not grandly, there was little enough there worth the stealing, but steadily and from a dozen small wounds at once. A chandler in the town billed for twice the tallow that ever reached the house. A quantity of sea coal appeared faithfully upon the page each quarter and never once in the cellar. A man was drawing a steady wage for the upkeep of a boathouse that had gone into the sea, timber and all, some 6 years before. The estate was poor, and that was true and would remain true, for the fixed quarterly sum the Duke sent down was a modest one. exactly the allowance a careful man sets for a household he expects shortly to shrink by one mouth and then to close up entirely. But poor was not at all the same thing as robbed. Rosamond closed the accounts of the men who were cheating her, one after another, in letters so scrupulously polite and so exactly particular that not a single one of them dared to raise his voice in answer. And within one turn of the seasons, the same small money went half again as far as it had. The old groundsman was named Roland Trewin, a taciturn man of very few words and fewer opinions ever offered unasked, who had served at Gulhaven since before the old Duke's time, and had watched the place decline about him for 20 years, with the flat resignation of a man watching a tide he cannot turn. He did what he was bid, and not one stroke more, for the long habit of being bid to do things that came to nothing had worn the willingness clean out of him. Rosamond did not order him about. She went out to him instead, on her slow and careful walks about the grounds, and she asked him things, what the walled garden had grown, in its day, and why it grew nothing now, where the wind came hardest across the headland, and where the ground lay sheltered, which of the tumble-down outbuildings were sound under their neglect and which were only pretending to be. He answered her shortly at first, and watched her sidelong to see whether she was mocking him, but she listened to what he said, and she carried it away and turned it over, and she came back to him the next day having plainly thought upon his answer as though it were worth the thinking, and by slow degrees Roland Trewin began to give her more than short answers, because she was the first living person in 20 years who had put a question to him as though the answer to it might actually matter. Together, that spring, they shut the seaward wing. It was past all saving, without a fortune neither of them had, and every winter Gale tore more of it loose and let more of the wet into the sound part of the house behind it. Roland boarded over the connecting doors and stripped the wing of every last thing that might yet be of use, and gave the rest of it over to the sea, and with that one hard, clean decision the house that remained became, for the first time in a generation, a thing that could be kept dry and kept warm. The walled garden was Rosamond's own particular campaign, and she loved it in a way she had never loved anything under her father's roof. It had been built long ago in the old careful manner, a high rectangle of dressed stone set to break the salt wind, and the soil inside it was good soil still, only choked and gone to nettle and abandoned. She could not dig it herself, her heart would not answer for the labour of it, and she had learned not to ask it to, but she could plan it, bed by bed, on paper, in the evenings, and she could pay a boy or two up from the cove out of the money her closed accounts had freed, and she could sit upon a low stool in the lee of the warm south wall in the thin returning sun, and direct the clearing of the ground, and she found in this a contentment deeper and steadier than any she had known. By the second spring the walled garden fed the household and had greens and roots to spare besides. By the third it grew salad herbs and early things that the town had always before been obliged to send a great distance for, and a man came out from the market with a cart every week to carry away what Gulhaven could spare and to leave good coin behind him. The sea itself gave her the rest of it in the end. She had feared it that first winter, the great cold, patient thing that worked at the cliffs below, and had seemed, in her fever, to call the roll of the dead and pause at her name. But a body cannot go on fearing a thing it lives beside every hour of every day, and by the close of the first year she had come to a wary truce with it, and by the close of the second she had learned to turn it to her use. The cove below Gulhaven sheltered a handful of fishing families who scraped a hard and chancy living from it, and who had no good means of keeping a heavy catch in the fat weeks so as to sell it through the lean ones. Rosamond, who understood trade the way other people understood breathing, saw the whole of the answer at a single glance. She had the old salting sheds down by the strand put back into repair. She set an old cove widow who had done the work in her girlhood to teach it again to the younger women, and she was careful to have the method exactly right, for she had learned early that the cove would forgive her a great deal, but would never forgive her a thing done wrong that they knew how to do right. Gulhaven began to buy up the surplus of the boats in the crowded weeks, and to cure it in the sheds against the empty ones, and to send it inland by the cartload when the price was high, and both the cove and the house upon the cliff were the better and the warmer for it. It was no fortune. It was a living, an honest, salt-smelling, hard-won living, raised out of a ruin that everyone had left her in to die, and it was wholly her own, and that made it worth more to her than any fortune she could have been given outright. 3 winters passed in this fashion. The frail bride, who was to be dead by the first spring, balanced ledgers, and mended a roof and coaxed a garden out of salt ground, and turned a cold and dying house into a place where fires burned in the grates, and people were fed at the table, and a blunt old housekeeper and a silent old groundsman came, without ever quite deciding to love her as their own. She thought of the Duke rarely, and without much heat when she did. He was a name upon a quarterly letter, a signature that had purchased her and freed her in the very same motion. She wore his ring still, though not upon her finger, where it had never once sat true. She had strung it instead on a cord about her neck and wound it round with a twist of wool, because that was easier than explaining its absence to the Cove women, and because, though she did not look too closely at this, it served to remind her of the girl who had gripped the chapel rail and refused to fall, and of everything that girl had built since to prove herself right against the judgment of every soul who had written her off. She did not expect ever to see the man again. She had built her whole life, stone upon careful stone, on the firm foundation of never seeing him again. She was in the little estate office on a raw afternoon late in that third autumn, going over the season's salting tallies with the marketman's figures spread across the desk before her, when Roland Trewin came in at the door without knocking, which in 3 years he had never once done, and stood there turning his cap over in his hands, with a look upon his weathered face that she had not seen there before. "There's a rider come up the cliff road, your grace," he said. "Up from the town. It's the Duke himself." Rosamond set down her pen. For a moment the small room was very quiet, with only the sea beyond the walls and the settling of the fire in the grate to fill it. She looked down at her own 2 hands where they lay upon the ledger, browned now from the garden and roughened at the knuckle, no longer at all the soft and useless hands of the girl in the chapel, and she found, with a small, grim satisfaction, that they were perfectly steady. "Well," she said, "he has come to bury me. He is 3 winters late for the funeral." Alexander Mallory came up the long cliff road, braced in his very soul for a grave. He had told himself the whole of the way down from London exactly what he would find at the end of it. A house boarded and silent, a fresh stone standing in the churchyard below, some grim housekeeper in her blacks who would hand him the keys and a small sad bundle of a dead girl's things, and be heartily glad to see the back of him, and of the place both. He had left her here 3 years and had never once inquired after her, and he had spent 3 years telling himself that this was a species of mercy, that a dying woman was better left in her peace than harried by a husband who could offer her nothing but his cold company. He knew now, riding up with the sea at his shoulder, that it had never been mercy at all. It had been cowardice, the very same cowardice that had kept him off this coast for 13 long years. He had married a dying girl, and left her by the water because it was the one arrangement on the earth he could be entirely certain would never again ask a single thing of him. He had been wrong about that, as it happened. He seemed lately to have been wrong about a very great many things. The road ran out along the top of the cliff, and the sea opened enormous below him, grey and vast and moving, and Alexander made himself look at it. It was harder than he had thought it would be, even now, even after so long. The sound of it went straight through his breastbone to a room he kept locked, and had kept locked for 13 years, and for a moment he was 19 years old again, and the water was closing green and silent over a fair bright head that did not rise, and his own hand was reaching and reaching through the cold and closing upon nothing at all. He shut his eyes and rode blind a moment. When he opened them, the road had turned inland toward the house, and he dragged a breath down past the tightness in his chest, and he rode on. Then he came round the last stand of thorn bent flat by the wind, and he saw Gullhaven, and he drew rein without meaning to, and simply stared. The drive had been swept. That was the first thing, absurd and enormous and impossible. The drive had been swept clean, and the gates were mended and rehung and swung true upon their hinges. The ivy had been cut hard back off the walls, and the fallen mortar made good with fresh. There was clean glass in windows that had stood boarded, and firelight moving warm behind some of them. His eye climbed the roofline and caught the smoke going up straight and unhurried from 3 several chimneys, ordinary and domestic and profoundly alive. The seaward wing stood dark and shuttered and plainly given up, but the whole of the rest of the house stood square and kept and warm against the grey sea behind it, and there were hens scratching in the swept yard, and a cart standing by, and a woman crossing from the kitchen door with a basket on her arm. A woman dressed not at all like a mistress, but who moved, He could see even at that distance like a person who belonged wholly to the place, and to whom the place in turn belonged. Alexander sat his horse in the mended gateway, and could not make the sight in front of him come right inside his head. He had ridden 3 days to bury a wife. The house was not a tomb. The house was more alive than any place he owned in the world, more alive than the great cold Wrenmere seat, more alive than his handsome rooms in town, and he had done nothing toward it, sent nothing, been nothing, and it had happened all the same, in his long absence, against his every flat expectation, by the will and the 2 hands of a woman he had left standing in that very forecourt to die. Roland Trewin met him in the yard, and took the horse's head without a word, and with a look in his eye that held no deference in it whatsoever. Mrs. Pengelly came to the kitchen door and dropped him a curtsy, and did not trouble to smile. And then, out of the passage behind her, a voice said, clear and unhurried, "Let him come in, Mrs. Pengelly. He has ridden a great way to see a grave. It would be unkind to send him off again without so much as a proper look at it." She came out into the low gold light of the yard. Alexander would not have known her had he passed her in a street. The girl he had married had been a wisp of a thing, grey in the face, swaying at a rail, the whole of her strength bent to the single labour of remaining upright. The woman who came out to him now was slight still and pale, and there was a carefulness in the way she carried herself that spoke of a body she had learned exactly how far to trust, and not one step further. But she stood straight, and her eyes came up to his, and took his measure without the least trace of fear in them, and her hands were the hands of a woman who worked, and there hung about her a settled, rooted authority that filled the whole of that yard more completely than his rank had ever filled a room in his life. She wore a plain grey gown and a working shawl, and at her throat he saw, on a cord, not upon her finger, and wound about with a twist of wool, hung the 2 large ring he had pushed over her knuckle in the chapel, and had not once thought of since. "Your Grace," Rosamond said, "you must forgive the disorder. We had no word to expect you, and are not at all set up to receive. Had you only written ahead that you were coming to bury me, I should have made shift to be a good deal more obliging about it." He found that he had no words at all in him. He, who had commanded rooms and men and the whole cold machinery of his ancient name, stood now in the swept yard of the ruin he had abandoned, and could not find his tongue, and she watched him fail to find it, and did not lift a finger to help him. "You are alive," he managed at last. It was not in the least what he had meant to say. It was, in point of fact, idiotic, and he heard the idiocy of it hang in the still air between them. "I am," Rosamond agreed gravely. "I do beg your pardon for it. I understand it was not at all the arrangement." She turned toward the door and the warmth beyond it. "You had far better come in. Whatever business has brought you, you cannot well conduct it standing in the yard, and Mrs. Pengelly has the fire lit, and we are very careful indeed about our fires here. We had to learn to be." The dinner that night was a strange, cold, exactingly formal affair, taken in a small warm parlour that had plainly once been a servants' hall, at a table laid with mismatched plate, and set with food that was simple and very good, and had every scrap of it been grown or caught within a mile of where the 2 of them sat. Alexander ate little and watched her much. She addressed him precisely as she might have addressed a factor come about the terms of a lease, courteously, competently, and without the least particle of warmth, and she laid before him over the course of that meal, in the same level and unhurried voice, exactly what had become of his estate and his money and his wife. Every word of it was a quiet and unanswerable indictment, and he had no defence to offer against any part of it, and he did not try to make one. "The seaward wing is shut," she told him. "It could not be saved short of more than we had, and to have chased good money after it would have taken the roof off the sound part of the house inside of 10 years. So we gave it to the sea. Your old rooms are in it, or were. I have put you in the small chamber on the inland side. It is warm, and it is dry, and the window does not rattle in the night. I hope you will not find it beneath you. We have every one of us learned in this house to prefer a small warm room to a grand cold one." "That was my mother's chamber," he said. "The inland room." "Then you will know it for a good one," she said, and did not soften by so much as a word. "Everything sound in this house is sound because at some point someone chose the warmth over the grandeur. I would a great deal rather you slept well than that you slept in state." He conceded the room. He conceded, over the long cold length of that dinner, a great many things besides, that the accounts were kept better than his own steward kept his, that the garden and the curing trade together brought in more clear coin than the estate had seen since his father's day, that the whole household ran as smooth and true as a well-kept watch, and that every hand under its roof looked to her and to no one else, and least of all to him. He had come down expecting to settle an estate, and had found there was nothing whatever left to settle. It was settled already, and settled well, by the one woman on the earth he had supposed least capable of settling anything at all. His displacement was total, and it was, he understood with a slow and mounting shame, entirely just. He owned a great name and an old title and money more than enough, and here, in the single place he possessed that was truly and warmly alive, he was the least useful person beneath the roof. He did not leave in the morning. There was a matter, he told himself, of the accounts to be gone through, of understanding what precisely had been built up in his name, and without his knowledge. But the truth of it, which came to him only slowly and against his will over the days that followed, was that he could not make himself go. There was something in the warm, salt-smelling, hard-won life of Gulhaven that he had never in the whole of his cold life possessed, and had not known until now that he wanted, and at the very centre of it stood a woman who owed him nothing, and asked him for nothing, and he was beginning at last to see, a great deal more than he had ever had the wit to imagine when he signed her name and his own upon a paper and rode away. On the third day, he tried the one thing he understood. He came to her in the office with a folded draft upon his London bankers, and named a sum that would have re-roofed the whole of the seaward wing and reglazed every window in the house, and left a great deal over besides, and he set it upon the desk before her, as though it were the plainest matter in the world. Rosamond looked at the draft, and then she looked at him, and she did not touch it. "No," she said. "It is nothing to me," he said, and meant it kindly, and heard even as he said it how badly it fell. "You have starved this place back to life on a housekeeper's allowance. There is no need. I can have the whole of it made sound before the spring. You need only take it." "I am sure you can," Rosamond said, "and if I take it, then it is your house that I have mended, with your money, in your absence, and I am after all only the wife you left here to mind it, until you had a use for it again. No." She pushed the folded draft back across the desk toward him with one browned finger, unhurried. "This place stands because it was made to stand on what it earns. If it cannot keep its own roof over its own head, out of its own garden, and its own sheds, then it has no business having a roof at all, and I will not pretend otherwise merely because a rich man has ridden up and would like to feel of use. If you wish to be of use to Gulhaven, your grace, you will find the tools in the low shed by the wall, and Roland will tell you where the sea-wall wants mending." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, to his own considerable surprise, he took up the draft and folded it back into his coat, and he said, "Very well." And the next morning, at first light, he went and found the tools in the low shed by the wall. The trouble with Sir Godfrey Crail came upon them in his second week at the house, and it handed him, at long last, something that he could actually do. Crail was a baronet whose land ran along the coast to the south, a florid, grasping, loud-voiced man who had watched Gulhaven's cove trade grow through 3 seasons with a covetous and calculating eye, and who had come to the conclusion, a shrewd one as far as it went, that a duke who never came near the place, and a duchess who was reported far and wide to be dying, made together for the sort of neighbour a man might rob at his leisure, and without much fear. He produced from somewhere among his papers an old and exceedingly doubtful claim to the salvage and the mooring rights of the whole cove, and he had men enough and boats enough to press it, and on a grey and blustering morning he threw a blockade across the narrow mouth of the little harbour, turned back the market carts upon the cliff road, and let it be widely known that the cove and every ounce of its trade were his now to license as he saw fit, at a rate that would strangle the whole of it inside a season. Rosamond had faced him down twice already across the width of the harbour water that autumn, and had held her ground with nothing but words moved no boats, and the cured catch was piling in the sheds with no cart to carry it to market, and the cove families who had trusted their winter to her were beginning, quietly, to be afraid. She did not ask the Duke for help. That was the thing that Alexander noticed, and having noticed it could not stop noticing. She stood at the office window that morning with the tallies of the spoiling fish spread out before her, and her jaw set hard, working at the problem alone, exactly as she had worked at every problem set before her for 3 solid years. and it did not so much as cross her mind to turn and put it to the powerful man beneath her own roof. She had learned her lesson too thoroughly, and at too great a cost, that no one was coming, that no one ever came, that whatever was to be done she must find the means to do herself. And it was that, more than anything else in those weeks, the plain sight of her squaring her thin shoulders to do battle alone with a man twice her size and weight, because it had never once in her life been safe for her to count upon another living soul, that reached at last past everything cold and locked and frightened in Alexander Mallory, and took hold of him and would not let go. He did not announce what he meant to do. He went quietly up to the office when she had gone down to the sheds, and he wrote a single letter. It was a short one. He knew a very great deal, in the way that dukes come to know such things, of the private affairs of the lesser men whose lands ran up against his own, and he knew in particular that the whole of Sir Godfrey Crail's comfortable fortune rested a good deal more upon brandy that had never troubled a customs house than upon anything Crail would care to have looked into. Alexander wrote to him gentleman to gentleman. He expressed his warm and neighbourly interest in the customs business of the district. He mentioned in passing that he found himself minded to take the whole question of coastal enforcement up with certain friends of his in London who owed him favours of long standing, and he observed, as though it were the merest afterthought, how very glad he had been to learn that the small misunderstanding over the Goolhaven Cove had been so happily and so quickly resolved in his Duchess's favour, as he was entirely certain upon reflection that Sir Godfrey would wish it to be. He sent it down by a fast rider and said nothing whatever to anyone. Crail's boats were gone from the harbour mouth before noon of the following day. The market carts came through unhindered. The claim was never heard of again from that hour to this, and when Rosamond, bewildered and instantly suspicious, went down to the cove to find the whole blockade simply and unaccountably vanished, it was one of the cove men who told her, scratching his head, that he'd heard tell the Duke had had a quiet word somewhere. She came back up the cliff path slowly, thinking, and found Alexander in the yard mending a hinge that did not, strictly speaking, want mending, and she stood and looked at him a long while before she spoke. "You did that," she said. It was not quite a question. "I wrote a letter," he said, not looking up from the hinge. "It cost me nothing at all. Crail is a coward with a great deal to hide, and cowards with a great deal to hide are the easiest men in England to be rid of. It was very easily done. You would have beaten him yourself in the end, I have no doubt of it. I only made the thing quicker. You did not tell me you meant to." "No." Now he did look up, and there was something in his face that was almost difficulty, almost shyness, strange upon a man built as he was built. "I did not wish it to become a thing that you owed me. You have spent 3 years owing no man living anything at all. It seemed to me a rare and considerable achievement. I did not care to spoil it." To that Rosamond said nothing whatever, but something shifted in the set of her shoulders. Some small fraction of the guard she carried always about her came down, and she nodded once, slowly, and went inside. And that night at the dinner table she spoke to him, not warmly, not yet, nothing so much as that, but as to a man, and not as to a factor come about a lease, and it was the first time in 3 years that anyone had heard her do so. The storm came down upon them a fortnight after, at the ragged tail end of the autumn, one of the great southwesterly gales that pile the whole grey weight of the sea up against the land and drive it in, over the low fields at the foot of the cliffs where the Cove families ran a few beasts and mended their nets. Alexander woke to it, in the black dead middle of the early morning, the whole house shuddering and groaning about him in the wind, the sea one long unbroken roar that he could feel come up through the very floorboards into the soles of his feet, and it took him at once an entire straight down the years to the worst night that he had ever lived, and it was some minutes before he could master himself enough to rise. When at last he came down, Rosamond was already at the kitchen door with her cloak about her, and Mrs. Pengley was arguing with her fiercely and to no effect at all, and out in the streaming black beyond the door the Cove was in trouble. The surge had come further and faster in than any within living memory. The low field lay under running water, and a boy, Tamsin's young brother, out too soon after a boat that had broken its mooring, had gone into it after a bawling beast, and got himself caught where the flood ran fastest, between the field and the black teeth of the rocks, clinging with both arms to a fence post, while the water climbed his body inch by inch and the current dragged and dragged at his legs. They could see him from the cliff path by the pitching light of the lanterns, a small, dark, desperate shape out in the wild white water, and no boat could live to come at him from the seaward side, and the tide was still making, still climbing, still coming on. Rosamond went. Alexander understood it afterward. Though in the moment there was no time to understand anything, she went because she was who she was, because a child of her cove was in the water, and she had spent 3 hard years making these people her own, and would no more have stood upon the safe high path and watched him drown than she would have reached in and stopped the beating of her own heart. She went down into the flooded field with a coil of rope that Roland thrust upon her, wading where the water ran only waist-deep along the field's inland edge, working her slow, careful way out toward the boy along the drowned line of the fence, and Alexander came off the path and into the black water after her, with his own heart lodged hard in his throat, and the roar of the sea filling up the whole of the world. She reached the boy. She got the rope about him under his arms, and she prized his locked fingers off the post, and closed them instead upon the line, and the men on the higher ground hauled, and the boy came in across the flood, coughing and choking and alive. But the effort of it had been far, far too much for the frail and stumbling engine in Rosamond's chest. Alexander, wading toward her through the drag of the water, saw her turn to follow the boy in along the fence, and saw her stop, and put one hand flat to her breast, and saw her face go the terrible grey-white he remembered from a cold chapel 3 winters gone, her lips darkening, her breath tearing shallow and fast and useless in her throat. And then the current, freed all at once of the boy's weight upon the line, took her, and she went down under the black running water and did not come up. He did not think. There was no thinking in it anywhere at all. He went into the sea that had taken his brother, into the exact cold green particular horror that he had spent 13 years and the whole width of England in flight from, and he did not hesitate for so much as the space of a single breath. He got to her. He got both arms about her under the surface and dragged her head up into the air, and he fought the current with the dead weight of her against him the whole terrible length of that flooded field, and where the drowned fence gave out beneath his reaching hand, he simply gathered her up and carried her, staggering and half-drowned himself and swallowing the sea until the water was at his knees, and then his ankles, and then Roland's hard hands and other hands out of the dark were hauling the two of them up together onto the solid, blessed, rising ground. She was breathing, barely and badly, her lips gone blue, and her heart racing and stumbling wild under his flattened hand when he pressed it to her breast, but breathing. He carried her up the cliff path himself, and would suffer no other man to touch her, and they got her into the warm, small room off the kitchen, and out of the drowned and freezing clothes, and Mrs. Pengelly worked over her with hot bricks wrapped in flannel, and with the drops the town physician had left long ago against exactly such an attack of the heart as this, and slowly, across the worst single hour of Alexander's life since he was a boy of 19, the awful grey ebbed back out of her face, and her breath came easier by degrees, and her heart, beneath his hand, steadied down and down to something near its own halting rhythm. She did not fully wake until near dawn, and when she did, the first thing that her eyes found in the low candlelight was the Duke of Renmere, sitting on the bare stone floor beside her low bed, soaked to the skin and shaking with the cold and something worse than the cold, holding her one hand fast in both of his own, as though it were the last fixed and certain thing in a whole turning and drowning world. "You went into the sea," she said. Her voice was the barest thread of itself. "Yes," he said. "You don't go near the sea." She had marked it 3 years before in a rocking carriage on the cliff road, and stored the fact away, and never once understood the meaning of it. "You wouldn't look at it. Not once, the whole way here." "No," he said. And then, at last, because the storm was still going out in the dark and beating on the cliffs below, and every last one of his defences lay drowned and lost somewhere out in that flooded field, and this frail and impossible woman had very nearly died in front of his eyes and in his arms, the locked door came open, and Alexander Mallory, who had not wept since he was 19 years old, wept silently and terribly, holding fast to his wife's cold hand, while the sea broke and broke upon the rocks below the house. She let him. She did not say any of the foolish and useless things that people say. She only turned her hand within his, so that she was holding him now as much as he held her, and she waited, and after a long while it began to come out of him in broken pieces. His brother, Edmund, younger than himself by 2 years, the fair one, the laughing one, the one their cold, hard father had not been able to help loving best, and whom Alexander himself had also loved best, without a grain of grudge in it, because Edmund had been simply impossible not to love. They had come down to Gulhaven every summer as boys, in the years before the old Duke shut it up and let it fall. It had been a happy house then, full of light and salt and noise. They had swum in the cove and had known its currents, or believed with a boy's whole certainty that they knew them, better than the cove men themselves. The summer that Alexander was 19 and Edmund 17, they had gone in off the low rocks below the house on a bright, still, windless afternoon, and a current had come round the point that neither of them had reckoned upon, a thing the calm, flat surface had given no warning of at all, and it had taken Edmund. Alexander had been not 10 yards off. He had seen his brother's face turn to him, and seen his hand come up out of the water reaching, and he had swum for him with every last thing that was in his body, and the sea had simply and patiently put itself between them, vast and gentle and immovable, and he had reached and closed his hand upon cold green water, and Edmund had gone down, and had not come up again. They found him 2 days after, 3 miles along the coast. I was the strong swimmer, Alexander said into the grey and growing light. I was the elder of us. I was not 10 yards from him, and I could not reach him. I've gone over it every single day for 13 years. There was nothing that I could have done differently, and I have not once in 13 years been able to stop trying to do it differently. My father never spoke of it, and never forgave me for it, and I never forgave myself, and I could not so much as look at the sea afterward. I have not set foot on this coast in 13 years. When I had need of a place to put a wife I meant never to think of again, I sent her here, of all the places in England, because I knew past any doubt that I would never come to it. I sent you to the one spot on the earth I was too great a coward ever to visit. He looked at her then, wrecked and open and stripped of every last piece of the cold armour he had worn so long that he had forgotten it was armour. I left you here to die in the very place I had not the courage to come and see. That is the whole of it. That is the man that you were married to. Rosamond was quiet for a time. Out beyond the window the storm was blowing itself ragged and spent, and the first hard grey light was coming up cold across the water. You went into the sea for me tonight, she said at last. That same sea. You did not stop even a moment on the bank. I saw you. I felt you take hold of me. I could not have stopped, he said. Not for you. There was no stopping in it. I know, she said. That is the thing I am telling you. And she drew his bowed dark head down against her, this frail woman with the stumbling heart, and she held the strongest and the coldest and the most frightened man in 3 counties while the storm went out at last over the sea, and neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing left that needed saying, that had not just been said between them, without any words at all. The winter that came after was not like the 3 that had gone before it. He stayed. He did not announce that he was staying, any more than he had announced the letter that broke Crail, or the draft he had folded silently back into his coat. He simply did not go, and the small inland chamber that had been his mother's became his own, and the household made a place for him within its workings, the way a river makes a place among itself for a new fallen stone. And Alexander Mallory, Duke of Renmere, who had never in his life earned his bread with his hands, learned that winter and the bright long summer after it to work. He learned it badly at the first, and then, by slow degrees, he learned it well. He hauled nets in the raw cove dawns until his soft duke's hands blistered and split and bled and at last hardened over. He mended the sea-wall below the low field alongside Roland Trewin, the 2 of them shifting and setting the great cold stones in the wind week after week, until the wall stood proof against the next surge that came, and the cove men who had watched him at it in the beginning with open contempt came round, grudging inch by grudging inch, and then all at once, first to nodding at him when he passed, and then to asking his opinion on a matter, and then, which was the surest sign of all, to freely giving him theirs. He learned the curing sheds and the ledgers and the walled garden. He was strong, and he proved tireless once he had at last been given something worth being tireless for, and he had spent the whole of his life until now with nothing whatever that was worth it, and now he had this, a house and a cove and a trade, and fires that burned in the grates and were never let go out, and a woman who was, across that winter and the spring that followed it, coming by the slowest of degrees to look at him with something that was no longer merely the courtesy one shows a factor, for it was slow, and he was careful never to hurry it, having understood at last that it was not his to hurry. Rosamond had built the whole of herself upon the hard foundation of the certainty that no one was ever coming, and she did not give that certainty up in a single night, nor in a single season, whatever a man had confessed to her weeping on the cold floor of her room. She watched him. She let him prove it, day after ordinary and unremarkable day, net after net, stone after stone, one cold dawn upon another, present and present, and present again, when every previous fact of her whole life had taught her past argument that he would be gone by spring. He never once said to her that he was sorry. She marked that too, and understood it, and did not find that she wanted the word. It would have been cheap, and they both of them knew it would have been cheap, and he was paying instead in the only coin that had any worth at all, which was to stay and to labour, and to be seen plainly staying and labouring through every weather. By the time the walled garden came green again for the fourth spring, she had stopped waiting for him to leave her. By the middle of the summer she had lost the power to imagine it, and the wounds did not go quietly, either of them, for wounds so old and so deep are not healed by a single night, however terrible, however tender. There was a black night in the deep of that winter, when Alexander woke the whole house with a cry, thrashing and drowning in his sleep in the small inland room, back in the green water with Edmund's hand going down before him, and it was Rosamond who came to him with a candle, and sat upon the edge of the bed, and took his shaking shoulders in her two thin hands, and spoke low and steady to him, until he came back to himself, and knew the room, and knew her. And there was a bright, hard day, at the very turn of the spring, when Rosamond overreached herself, carrying seedlings out to the walled garden, too glad of the sun and too impatient of her own frailty, and her heart set up its old frightening stumble, and the world went grey at its edges, and her lips began to blue, and it was Alexander who caught her before she fell, and carried her in, and sat her by the range, and knelt and chafed her cold hands between his own warm blistered ones, and did not scold her, and did not leave her side until the colour came back into her face. Each of them tended the other through the collapse of the other. Each learned the exact shape and weight of the other's particular fear, and learned to stand beneath it when it fell. That, and not the storm, and not the confession, was the true thing that grew between them across that winter and that spring. Two people, each of them broken in a different place, discovering that the broken place in the one was answered by the whole and steady place in the other, and that leaning was not, after all, the same thing as falling. There was an evening on the cliff terrace at the tail of that long bright summer that Rosamond kept and turned over in her mind ever afterward, as the moment she let the last stone of the wall come down. They had been speaking of nothing of any weight at all. The price the cured pilchard was fetching in land, some small repair the curing shed wanted before the autumn, and there was a plain earthenware jug of water on the weathered table between them, and Alexander, in the very middle of a sentence, reached across and filled her cup before ever he filled his own. Some small, ordinary kindness she had grown so used to that she scarcely marked it now. And then, instead of drawing his hand back to his side, he laid it over hers where it rested upon the warm stone of the table, and left it there. And Rosamond, who had raised a home up out of a grave and a whole self up out of nothing, and had not leaned the weight of her body or her heart upon another living soul in the whole of her adult life, turned her hand beneath his, and let it be held, and did not take it back. And they sat like that in the failing gold of the evening, while the light went slowly off the water and the swifts cut and turned in the warm air above the roof, and neither of them said a word. Two people broken in different places, leaning at the last upon one another, which was the only thing that either of them had ever truly needed, and the one thing neither had ever thought to have. The courier came 3 days after that. He came up the cliff road in the king's own livery, mud to the knees of him and his horse blown, and he carried a sealed dispatch that he would put into no hand but the Duke's own. Alexander broke the seal upon it there in the yard, with Rosamond watching from the kitchen door, and he read it, and he went very still. It was from London, from men whose favours he had once collected, and was now himself owed. The government had need of him. There was an office, a permanent one, high and honourable, precisely the sort of place that his name and his abilities, and the whole long shaping of his life had fitted him to fill, and it required his immediate presence in the capital, and his continuing presence there, and it was, between its several courteous lines, not truly in the nature of a request at all. It was the whole of the life that he had been bred and born to, arriving on horseback to reclaim him, at the one moment in all his years when he had finally found in its place a life that was worth the having. He looked up from the paper and found Rosamond watching him from the doorway, and he watched the shutter come down again over her face, the old careful armour sliding smoothly back up into place after a whole summer of its slow and patient lowering, and he understood with a sick lurch of his heart what she was thinking before ever she opened her mouth to say it. "You had best pack your things," she said. Her voice had gone flat and even, the factor's voice, the chapel voice, the voice of a woman bracing her body to take a blow that she has always known was coming to her in the end. The Crown does not care to be kept waiting. It is a great office. It is what you are when all is said. I always knew that you would go in the end when the time came round for it. So go then, and go quickly, and let us not draw the thing out. We shall manage here. We have always managed here." She turned to go back inside, and Alexander crossed the yard in 3 long strides and caught her by the wrist and held her there. Not hard, but not to be shaken off either, and she stopped with her back to him, and her thin shoulders gone rigid under the shawl. "Look at me," he said. "There is nothing in it to look at," she said, without turning. "You are leaving. I would a great deal rather not watch you do it slowly. I have grown very tired, Your Grace, over these years, of standing in this yard and watching men ride away down that road, and I would take it for a kindness if you would only get on your horse and be gone." "Rosamond," he came round in front of her. "Look at me." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, and there was something terrible in the dryness of them, and he saw in them at last the whole of it, 3 winters and more of a woman who had taught herself, at a cost he could scarcely stand to reckon, never again to expect that anyone at all would stay. And he understood, standing there in the yard with her wrist in his hand, that this was the wound beneath the wound, older and deeper than the stumbling heart in her breast, that she had been left, and left, and left again, by her father, who sold her, by himself, who bought her and abandoned her, by every soul who had ever looked at her and seen a foregone conclusion, and that she had built the whole of her magnificent and unbreakable self upon the cold ashes of ever once being chosen, and that if he rode away now down that cliff road, he would prove her right in it forever, and there would be no coming back from it, not for him and not for her, not ever. So he did the only thing that could be made to answer her. He did not argue with her. He turned, still keeping her wrist gently in his hand, and he drew her with him back through the kitchen door and into the warmth to the great iron range that had burned day and night for 3 winters and more, and had not once in all that time been let go out, the warm beating heart of the house that she had raised with her own 2 hands up out of the dead. And there, in front of her, and of Mrs. Pengerley, and of Roland Trewin, who had come in from the yard behind them, and of the girl Tamsin standing wide-eyed by the dresser, Alexander Mallory took up the Crown's sealed and courteous summons, the great office, the high honour, the whole of the life he had been born and bred and shaped to live, and he pulled open the iron door of the range, and he put the paper into the heart of the fire, and he stood and watched it catch and curl and blacken and go up entire into ash and nothing. "There," he said, and his voice was not quite steady in him. "It is answered. I will not go. Let them make of it whatever they choose to make. They may have my seat, and my office, and my resignation, and my name, and whatever else it pleases them to take from me. I am not going back. Do you hear me, Rosamond? I am not going back. Not to London, not to any part of it, not for any summons the King himself can send. I spent 13 years of my life running from this coast, and I came to it at the last only to bury you, and instead I found the one living thing that I have ever owned in the whole of my life. I would sooner take off my own hand at the wrist than ride down that road away from it. Away from you." He took her face, then between his 2 hard, blistered, salt-cracked, work-roughened hands, as gently as if she were the frailest thing in the world, which in one way she was, and in every way that counted, she was not. "You made a home out of the grave that I sent you to," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive me for the grave. I do not think that it can be forgiven, and I will not insult you by asking it. I am asking you only to let the home be mine as well. Not the estate, not the title, not any of that. You are my home, Rosamond. You are the only home that I have ever had in my life. Let me stay in it. Let me stay." And Rosamond Mallory, who had gripped a chapel rail and refused to fall, who had beaten a fever and a thief and the whole grey weight of the sea itself, who had taught herself so thoroughly never to look to be chosen, and who had just now been chosen before a lit fire and 4 witnesses over the very crown of England, let go. The armour came down all at once, and this time it came down for good, and her dry and terrible eyes filled at the last and spilled over, and she took a fistful of the front of his rough shirt in her browned and work-hardened hand, as though to be entirely sure of him, to hold him fast to the earth, and she let herself be gathered in against him and held unhurried and complete and without the least fear in it, while the last of the summons went to grey ash in the range, and the sea moved gold and patient and forgiven beyond the walls of the warm room. "You are late," she said into the front of his shirt, and he felt rather than heard the crack in her voice that was very near to laughter. "You are 3 winters and a long summer late, Alexander Mallory. I know it," he said against her hair. "I know exactly how late I am. I intend to spend every day that your stubborn heart will give me in the making of it up to you. I have nowhere in this world I would rather be, and nowhere else that I will ever go." "No," she agreed, and drew back only far enough to look up into his face to be certain of it, to read it and find it true. "No, I don't imagine that you will." And she lifted her face to him, and he bent his head to her, and they kissed at last, there in the warmth beside the great iron range that was the beating heart of the house that she had built, not the frail grey girl and the cold black duke of that empty and freezing chapel 3 winters gone, but 2 people who had each of them reached down into deep and drowning water and dragged the other up out of it and into the air, standing now on ground that they had made themselves, out of ruin, with their own hands, and choosing it and choosing each other, for as many winters as her stubborn and unbeaten heart would grant the 2 of them together. What the men of London made of a duke who had burned their summons in his kitchen fire, and would not so much as answer their letters, the cove never rightly came to learn, and the 2 of them upon the cliff did not trouble over much to find out. There would be a reckoning of some kind, no doubt, in its own time. A great office does not go unfilled without someone somewhere growing angry about it, and a duke does not turn his back upon the crown without there being a price marked down somewhere against his name. But that was a trouble for another season, and they had weathered worse troubles than the displeasure of distant men, and there were nets to be hauled in the cold dawns, and a garden to be kept green behind its wall, and a sea-wall to be watched through the winter gales, and a house full of fires that were never, ever let go out. He never once, in all the long years that followed, said to her the word that she had never asked for. He said it instead in every cold dawn out on the grey water, and in every stone he set into the wall, and in every single night that he did not ride away. And she, who had learned young and hard the whole difference between the cheap word and the dear thing itself, found in the end that she preferred it so, and would not have traded it. For the strongest houses are not the ones that come to a man whole and grand by inheritance, but the ones that are raised up stone by patient stone out of the very place where a thing was meant to end, kept warm by fires that attended through the black of every winter and never once let die, and shared, at the very last, by 2 people who came the hard way to learn that a home is not a thing that you are given, nor a thing that you can command, but a thing that you build together with your own 2 hands, and warm, and hold, and refuse, ever again, come storm or summons, or the whole grey weight of the sea, to leave.